When we talk about modernity, what do we mean by that? This is something we've brought up before. What is it to be modern? How do you think of yourself as modern? Because you don't think of yourself as not modern, do you? What's modernity for you? How are you different than, say, your grandparents?
More technology.
Yeah, that's a huge one. You grew up with technology like this, right? Your grandparents, some of them actually have to use, the dumbed-down phones that they make just for them, the jitterbugs. Those of us in the middle, had to adapt. What else? So technology is really important. Yeah.
We have the opportunity for higher education.
Yeah. Education gets more and more widespread. Now, your grandparents' generation had the GI Bill that they could rely on, so many of them got to go to school fairly cheaply, which is different than you guys, since it's pretty expensive nowadays. But more of your generation is going to college. What else? Are there any other things that make you more modern than your grandparents? Other than being young and them being old.
I was going to say, like most religions are adapting to the new society in different senses, so what we're being taught might be a little bit different than what our grandparents were taught.
Okay, that's a good point too. Yeah, so what you actually got as your background assumptions, the sort of baseline stuff, is very different for you than it was for them. For example, how many of you have credit cards of one form or another? Very few of you? That's interesting, because they really market them up to college students. Back in your grandparents' time, when they were your age, very few of them would have credit cards, because you paid for things up front most of the time. But credit cards were starting to become part of the process. When I was your age, you couldn't use credit cards in a lot of locations. Nowadays, you use them everywhere, right? A lot of people don't carry any cash at all. That's a big change. The attitude towards taking on debt has changed. Now imagine, what about your grandparents and their own grandparents? How would they differ? How would your grandparents be more modern than their grandparents? Yeah.
Having a car.
Mobility, that's a big one. What else? Yeah.
I think they would have experienced as much diversity as people.
Your grandparents would have experienced more, or
Great-grandparents?
your great-great-grandparents would have experienced less?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that's right. In part because people weren't moving around as much. What else? Yeah.
Less class divide. You interact people with different classes. It was more isolated before.
You're saying that with your grandparents there's less of a class divide than there was before?
My great-grandparents from the 19th century.
Yeah, I think you're right. There was more mixing. And when we talk about your great-great-grandparents' generation, we're actually talking about the generations that were around at the time that these movements are really important. And if you go back further, you can think about what else counts as modern. Some of what we talked about as liberal Protestantism fits in with modernity. The coming on the scene of evolution as a major scientific theory. Modern biblical criticism. That shook up a lot of people. If you were to go back, say, 7, 8 generations, and just walk around on the street and ask, do you think that God really created the world in 6 days? Because, the seventh day he rested, right? Most people would have said yes. Do you think that would be the case now? A lot of people would say, I have no idea, right? But a lot of people would say, no, that's an allegory, it doesn't fit into modern science. This is the time when they were actually fighting out these battles that for us, in large part, are seen as one. So there were a lot of other things going on at the time as well that your book talks about. Large-scale immigration. Many of your great-great-grandparents, I'm willing to bet, were in fact immigrants. a matter of fact, it might have been your great-grandparents or your grandparents that were the ones who immigrated. Urbanization, that means concentrating people in cities. What do cities mean? Besides, a lot of noise. What else do cities do? They're kind of corrosive. They break down class barriers, like you were saying. People get exposed to all sorts of new ideas, see new ways of doing things. And industrialization. All these are major changes taking place that are part of modernity. And so, like your book says, by the turn of the 20th century, 3 broad-based new religious movements. These are all new. These are new things that are taking place here in America. Emerged from this cultural ferment, and they were going to transform the character of American Protestantism dramatically during the following decades. Holiness, Fundamentalism, and Pentecostalism. Each of them begins, like it says, as a climate of opinion within a Protestant community that was finding itself divided over challenges that are coming about because of evolutionary thought, biblical criticism, and pressures towards institutional, what they call routinization. When things become routine, how does that feel? You guys all have routines, right? Get up at a certain time. What's your major concern with right now as a student? What structures your day?
Making sure I wake up.
Yeah. 4.
I sleep through my alarm, so I need to wake up to get to class.
There you go, to get to class, right? Classes are the main things that structure your day. That's why you can't stay up as late as you want, even though it is college. You can't go out on every single night, because you have to get to class, because that's the purpose of what's going on here. Do all of you have a routine by this time in the semester? When you're going to do homework, when you're going to do reading, when you're going to go to the library. You can tell people basically where you're going to be at what time. Does that get boring? Do you need to shake up your routine once in a while? Was that one of the nice things about being on break? You weren't stuck doing the same, we're going to meet here now, at such and such a time and talk about this stuff. Well, the same thing is happening in people's lives at this time, and the same thing is happening with religion. And so holiness is a good one to start with. Holiness is a movement that's starting from the teachings of John Wesley. And who do you associate that guy with? Think back to earlier in the class. What denomination was he important in? Yeah.
The Methodists.
Very good. So this is starting out as a movement originally among the Methodists. And it comes to affect some Baptists as well. Now think about what Wesley was all about. Wesley was about a religion of the heart, wasn't he? He talked about sanctification, the need to experience this connection to God, a personal, intense conversion experience that would keep going on and on and on. That's what they called holiness or sanctification. Now, the Methodist Church, for a long time, was known for that. But after a while, things get kind of routine, and that kind of fell by the wayside the more that they started to fit into society and become just one denomination among others. So within the Methodist churches, there were some people who were saying, hey, we've lost our focus. Wesley actually knew what the real focus should be on holiness. And we need to do everything we can to try to get that back. So your book talks about this Phoebe Palmer from New York who founds a Tuesday meeting for the promotion of holiness. And the idea behind that was this promoting this personal experience of what Wesley called entire sanctification. This feeling that you had, connected with God and your life had been fundamentally changed. Palmer writes this book, The Way of Holiness, and then there's a whole bunch of other journals and books that get spun off from that. And this starts to develop an institutional network. They start having camp meetings. We talked about those before. Camp meetings or revival meetings. You would have a camp somewhere. People would preach constantly, and people would get very excited about this over the course of several days. They started holding summer camp meetings at places that are now kind of, where elite go, like Martha's Vineyard. And they started building cottages, and the whole idea was to try to get away from the ordinary routine and to focus intensely on developing this experience of holiness in a new environment. Your book also talks about the higher life movement. This is an Anglo-American movement, so it's involving people on both sides. And they followed the Reformed rather than Wesleyan theological tradition, but it also focused on this notion of holiness, or this notion of keeping yourself apart from the world. So if you wanted to remain in this sort of sanctified state, what are the things you think you'd have to do? Would that mean any changes in your lifestyle? If you were just, some businessman at the time, or dock worker, somebody working on the railroad. Are the things you'd have to avoid that you could think of? A lot of these holiness churches developed pretty elaborate codes. If a person really has this experience, they won't be out there drinking, for example, or gambling, or in some cases dancing. Why do people worry about dancing? We see that as pretty innocuous, I think, these days. Going to go to a dance. All right, have a good time. Yeah.
Is it because they're expressing themselves like in a way other than through God?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. And if you really wanted to point out things in the Bible, you could talk about, David danced, right? He expressed himself that way. Of course, his wife got really turned off in seeing him dancing. We also know from the Bible she was disgusted with him, so he must have been doing some strange moves. I suppose that could be part of it. They didn't put it so much in terms of you should only be expressing yourself, say, in words. It was more along the lines of worrying about the physicality of dancing. What happens when you dance with people?
Touch each other.
Yeah, there you go. And that leads to other things, and that's probably going to be leading you away from holiness. So that would be a problem. Gambling, that would be another thing to avoid. That would be leading people away from God. So your book also then talks about a few breakaway churches. The Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, Church of the Nazarene, Wesleyan Church. When we're talking about holiness churches, those are some of the denominations that we associate that with. Your book also talks about another one that you may not have realized is a religious denomination, the Salvation Army. Salvation Army is a holiness denomination. And they're called an army because they organize themselves according to a kind of military hierarchy and discipline. They focus on holiness theology and outreach to those who slipped through society's safety net. So think about that next Christmas when they're doing the bell ringing. Let's move on to fundamentalism. When you hear that term fundamentalist, what do you think of? Right off the bat.
Basics.
Basics, okay. What else? Yeah.
Tradition.
Okay, traditions. It turned out actually a lot of their traditions are not very old. There's that old joke that good old, old-time religion really isn't that old-timey. It's fairly new in its development. 19th century. What else? We use this term fundamentalist not just to talk about Christians. We use it much more broadly in kind of a sweeping way. What do we mean when we say somebody's a fundamentalist? What sort of attitudes or behavior can you expect from them? Would you want a fundamentalist roommate? Why not? I see some head shaking.
I think it's narrow-minded, or they don't like to do things out of the ordinary, or what they're not comfortable
That's something that's associated with fundamentalism, a very narrow perspective, yeah.
I was gonna say that, like, they base, like, their religion is based off of like a certain foundation, and they expand from there. They don't really, like, go out of the ordinary. Or what
Okay.
other religions try to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to characterize it. You had your hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say about the same thing. Like they just follow what's already known, like what's already written down.
Okay, so for Christian fundamentalists then, what is the fundamental, what is the basis going to be? Do you think? Remember, these are Protestants. These are not Catholics. They're not Eastern Orthodox. So we're not talking about churches that are, going back to traditions in the sense of where tradition with a capital T plays a role. What's going to be the basis for them then? I'll give you a hint. It'll be a book composed of books.
Bible.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, I brought in some props. When you hear talk about the fundamentals with respect to the fundamentalist movement, this is the fundamentals. This is actually, they released a number of different pamphlets. These are all those pamphlets that are all sort of gathered together in a 2-volume set, which I bought fairly cheaply, because I wanted to see what fundamentalists back then actually had to say. It turns out a lot of them were quite sophisticated. But you're right, they had a narrow basis on which they would work from. So I'll pass these around. You can take a look at them if you want to, or not. Fundamentalism is arising in these Christian churches in part because there's a lot of changes going on. There's a lot of accommodations to modernity. And some of these were seen as sort of breaking points, places where you can't compromise this any further. So, for example, the belief in the literal truth of the Bible, what they call biblical inerrancy, that's one of the things that they took a stand on. If you subscribe to the theory of evolution, then you're not going to be able to buy into biblical inerrancy in the notion that every single thing said in the Bible is literally true. You can't have both of those at the same time, can you? You have to choose. Now, does that mean that you can't have the Bible and have the theory of evolution in some way? No, you could meet in the middle somewhere and say, well, some of the things in the Bible are just allegorical, and that's what a lot of the churches did. Fundamentalists rejected that. So along with that sort of thing, they also rejected the notion that, you could explain Christ as just a nice guy, a really great ethical teacher. They insisted, no, either he's the Son of God or all bets are off. So one thing that you can say about fundamentalists is, at least at this time, they were very clear about what it was that they believed in, what it was that they said, well, we can't compromise on this. And what happened in the churches, we're talking about like Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, is there were a lot of battles between modernists and fundamentalists. And the modernists effectively won the battles within the churches, and the fundamentalists ended up getting pushed out and forming their own new churches. So if they were Presbyterians, they might form a new Presbyterian church. A lot of Baptists, because of the way Baptists tended to associate, could be fundamentalists and just disassociate from whatever convention they were in. And so your book talks about their emphasis on doctrine. That's what you see in those volumes there. There are certain things that doctrine or teaching can't compromise on. So they stress that, for example, the inspired Word of God is without error in its original autographs, that is as originally dictated by God to the authors of Scripture. There were some other key things that were considered to be fundamentals: the virgin birth, satisfaction theory of the atonement, literal characters of the miracles. And then there's some other things that are added in there that are particularly important. Remember we talked about millennialism? Premillennialism is this notion that the 1,000-year reign is nearby, but a lot of things have to happen on the way, like Armageddon and all sorts of trials and tribulations and the coming of the Antichrist. All those sorts of things are coming out of these apocalyptic books. And if you take everything within the Bible as being literally true, well, then you're committed to that understanding of time, that understanding of what's going to happen. So one of the things that comes in that mixes things up a bit here is what's called dispensationalism. And this is a form of premillennialism. So it's a form that says that, the 1,000-year reign is going to happen pretty soon, but all these bad things are going to happen first. Everybody's faith is going to be tested. And this guy Darby formulates a notion of a whole bunch of dispensations. Dispensations, think of them as like periods of time. So you move from one dispensation to the next, and in each one, there's like a different structure, a different plan for how things are going to be. God has different plans for two different peoples, and the Darbyites, like your book points out, postulated two supernatural occurrences. They said that the church age is nearing an end. So the church age is where most of the churches are actually like on the right track. How can you tell that the church age is coming to an end? Well, most of the churches aren't accepting this. The fundamentalists saw themselves as the real traditionalists, as the ones holding on to traditional Christian doctrine. They were really doing something a bit new without realizing it, but they saw all the other churches as having fallen away from them. That's what the word apostasy means. And they believed that the rapture was going to take place, then the tribulation, then there'd be the Battle of Armageddon. And they also believed that a lot of Jews were going to be converted to Christianity and suffer for it. So this gave them sort of a map or a timeline for what they thought was going to be happening. And one of the things you'll find fundamentalist discourses doing is trying to look at contemporary events and figure out how do they fit into this timeline. How do they map onto it? So, if you look at old literature from the 70s or 80s, you'll see a lot of people postulating that, the Antichrist would arise in, say, Russia, or back at that time, the Soviet Union. And Armageddon was going to be a battle between who? NATO, which still exists, and the Warsaw Pact. And then after, the Soviet Union falls and the Warsaw Pact falls apart, you have to kind of revise who's going to fill what role. But a lot of this is coming from this notion of dispensationalism. Your book also talks about Dwight Moody, and we've met up with this guy before, talking about him in terms of revivals. Dwight Moody founds this Moody Bible Institute, which is still in Chicago and is closely associated with fundamentalism. And then it finally talks about the fundamentals, which we're passing around. Then your book rolls in another group. To this. Jehovah's Witnesses. And Jehovah's Witnesses are not fundamentalists in the sense of, being part of that movement, but they do have a lot of things in common with them. Probably a lot of you have encountered Jehovah's Witnesses, right? As they knock on the door and want to share good news with you, and they have a lot of pamphlets. Yeah.
Me and my friend have this ongoing joke about how they're so harassful that you can't close the door when you're trying to shoo them away. And we laughed about that for a long time.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that stereotype, because they tend to be pretty aggressive. And part of the reason why is because they view themselves as trying to get the word out in a world that has turned against God and turned against religion, and they're trying to find the lost sheep. So you might be a lost sheep, and unless they work on you a bit, they won't find that out. And it does tend to turn a lot of people off. I had a fiance once who they came to the door, and I wasn't there. And then she told him, why don't you come back at this time, because he'll be back then, and I'm sure he'd love to talk with you. And I hated getting into these theological arguments, but she thought because I was a philosophy major I'd enjoy that. And I did not. In any case, your book talks about them a little bit. They, in American history, they're really important because a lot of the landmark Supreme Court cases are actually Jehovah's Witness cases, where because they would say, for example, refuse to salute the flag, they would encounter a lot of social opposition. Why would they refuse to salute the flag? They felt that that was idol worship. In their view, there can't be any God, or thing to worship other than Jehovah, and any sort of acknowledging of things that we sort of take for granted, like say saying the Pledge of Allegiance, would really be a form of worship for them and idolatrous. So they refuse to do that sort of thing. They don't serve in the military. That was an issue too. Conscientious objection. Yeah.
Did you ever hear about that? Like the most hated family in America, the Phelps family.
Yeah. Now they would sort of fit into the fundamentalist spectrum,
They would.
but is like a really far fringe group within that spectrum. Yeah. Their leader recently died.
I thought he was dying. I don't know.
No, he's dead now.
He's dead?
Yeah. It provoked a lot of controversy because where did they do a lot of their action on their part?
At funerals.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So people were like, well, what should we do at his funeral? And it was interesting. A lot of Christians showed up and they held up banners that said like, well, we're not going to hate you. Sort of like, trying to stick it to him. But he fits into this fundamentalist spectrum. You guys are all familiar with what we're talking about, this Westboro Baptist Church. They made a lot of media headlines because they would protest at soldiers' funerals. And they actually said, soldiers should die because America had embraced the homosexual agenda, as they put it. And so, we were an opposite nation. We were a nation that had fallen away from God. And so, therefore, every soldier's death was sort of like a sign of how off we were. This did not go over well with most people, including the families of these soldiers. They saw themselves as sort of like making a very deliberate point. Most people saw them in a very different light, I think. But yeah, that's a great contemporary example of this sort of thing. So back to Jehovah's Witnesses very briefly. Your book talks about the Watchtower and some of their distinctive teachings. They are non-Trinitarian. They don't have the same Trinitarian approach that most Christians do. They restrict full sainthood to the 144,000. After a while, they had to sort of revise their doctrine because they had more than 144,000 members, and so they had a theology of like the fully saved, and then the ones that were they would get to spend time with God Himself, and then the other ones would be saved, but they would be on a sort of recreated world. And then everybody else was going to the grave. So that's enough about those two groups. Pentecostals. What are they fundamentally about? When you hear that term Pentecostal, what do you associate that with? Is there anything that comes to mind? What would make a church or a Christian a Pentecostal one? There is something distinctive. Some people will say snake handling, but it's not the snake handling. That's a very fringe practice among a few of them.
I was going to say, because Pentecost was when the Holy Spirit came down, right? And then
Right.
The apostles went out and were basically missionaries after that because they could speak different languages.
That's the key right there. So, you're right. Book of Acts talks about the Pentecost. Pentecost is 50 days after the ascension. And this speaking in tongues phenomena. There's a technical term for that, glossolalia. There's always a technical term for everything, isn't there? Usually it turns out to be some Greek words crammed together. Glosso means tongues, lalia means speaking in, or babbling in. So speaking in tongues. In the early 20th century, although there were manifestations of this previously among other religious communities, there is a movement that develops specifically around the experience of speaking in tongues understood as a gift of the Holy Spirit. And the origins of this are a little bit murky. It looks like it actually had 3 different origin points. A lot of Pentecostals will talk about the Azusa Street Revival, which took place in LA, but that actually has some background that your book talks about with some other churches earlier. And Pentecostalism starts springing up in different places. It never provided one completely unified movement, so it split a couple times into different emphases in churches. So your book starts out by telling you a little bit about the phenomenon. We should probably spend a little bit of time on that. Early on, the Pentecostals believed that they were actually speaking in actual human languages, which they would use for doing mission work. And then they went off to do mission work, and they found out that they weren't actually able to speak the languages of the places that they went to. So the theology gets revised, and there's a lot of different variants on it. Some people call it the language of the angels. Some people say it's, spirit language. Whatever it is, what we do know linguistically is that it shows consistent verbal patterns, because linguists have studied this. There are dialects of it that vary from place to place and church to church. There's a lot of phonemes in it, but they tend not to be phonemes that the person doesn't use in their current native language. And it doesn't have any sort of syntax like a normal human language does. Is it a language or not? Really, that depends on your perspective. It is central for these churches' experience and for their beliefs. So we don't actually have to decide for ourselves how to view it. It's enough to know that for Pentecostals, they view it as being part of their worship. So your book talks about Los Angeles, Kansas, and Central Tennessee as all focal points. And they want to say that the story begins in Topeka, Kansas with this Charles Fox Parham. He founds a Bible Institute, and according to the traditions, people start speaking in tongues. And they saw this as sort of the restoration of what was going on in the book of Acts. After this, the real big explosion takes place in Los Angeles. And you probably don't associate Los Angeles with religion at this time, right? What do you associate it with? What is Los Angeles known for? Hollywood, right? What else? The beach. A lot of California for that. What else? Record industry. Music industry. Los Angeles is where a lot of new religions popped up in the early 20th century. And Pentecostalism fits in there. There was this Azusa Street Revival for 3 years. People are mixing together. And remember, at this time, this is pretty revolutionary to have blacks, whites, Hispanics, and others mixing together, eroding class divisions, and all of them united by this phenomenon of speaking in tongues. So, this leads to a number of different denominations that your book talks about. The Church of God in Christ, which is a largely African-American denomination. Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. This arises from a white holiness group. Assemblies of God is one of the larger, Pentecostal Holiness Church, and Church of the Foursquare Gospel. These are all Pentecostal groups. These are all Pentecostal churches. And later on, what they're doing is going to catch on among some of the others, as we're going to see in later chapters. Now, your book sums these up by saying in the early 20th century, these all experienced massive growth. By mid-20th century, they entered into a sort of period of eclipse. They didn't disappear. They continued to gather adherents, especially in what we call the Bible Belt. Bible Belt is the South and parts of the Midwest and Southwest. They became sort of marginal religions, attracting both the poor and the middle class, both black and white, in areas of the country least affected by modernization. So when we talk about the Bible Belt, we're looking at sort of a broad swath that's more traditional than other places. The last thing that your book actually talks about here, well, there's two last things it talks about here. One is the megachurch phenomenon. The megachurches, what are we talking about when we say megachurch? There are these gigantic churches where you can fit thousands and thousands of people, and usually nowadays it's, they have big screens so you can actually see what's going on. Those tend to be associated with these groups early on. The other thing that your book talks about that kind of put a cap in much of this and relegated it to outside the mainstream was the Scopes trial. What do you remember from American history class about the Scopes trial? Sometimes it's called the monkey trial. Why? Anyone remember? Those political cartoons, somebody holding up a sign, a gorilla holds up a sign saying, I'm your cousin. It was about evolution. This guy Scopes was teaching evolution in his classes, and he got in trouble for it. He was in the Bible Belt, and he got fired, and he appealed it. And the question was, should he actually, be punished for teaching what was at that time scientific theory in a science class? And what ended up happening was the trial made a lot of these groups look kind of backwards and foolish, and it led in part to their marginalization. So